There are few places in England more forgotten by time than the hamlet of Larkwood Hollow. Tucked deep within the rolling hills of Devon, it was a village so small that even the postman had to remind himself of its existence. A few winding lanes, a scattering of slate-roofed cottages, an ivy-strangled vicarage, and at its heart, like the jewel in a faded crown, stood St. Athanasius Chapel. The chapel had once drawn pilgrims from all over the West Country, famed in centuries past for a miraculous well that had since dried up. Now it served little purpose beyond housing pigeons in its tower and offering Sunday services to a dwindling congregation who came more out of habit than belief. But it remained a striking building, stone arches carved with angelic visage, stained glass depicting saints whose names no one remembered, and a heavy bronze bell that was said to toll by itself in times of great sorrow. That bell tolled on the last night of October. It was an unusually bitter evening for autumn, and the wind that swept through the hollow carried with it the rustle of dry leaves and something less definable, a whispering sense of unease. Mrs. Edwina Cole, widowed housekeeper of the chapel, heard the bell while stirring a pan of leek soup in the rectory kitchen. 12 chimes, she murmured. Ladle paused mid-stir. But it's only 11:40 by the kitchen clock. She peered out the window toward the chapel. All was dark. The bell tower stood solemn and still. No light in the vicar's study, no movement in the trees. She had the uncomfortable sensation of being watched, not by man, but by memory. Shivering, despite the stove, she ladled the soup into a bowl and drew the curtains shut with unnecessary force. The next morning, St. Athanasius was locked and the name on the parish register was gone. The news, like all oddities, took a while to travel. It made its way through whispers and market stalls, then via a letter from Reverend Giles to an old friend in London who, upon reading it, passed it along to a certain retired Belgian detective residing at Whitehaven Mansions. It was not a murder, not yet. It was simply a mystery, yet it intrigued Hercule Poirot enough to raise one of his famously symmetrical eyebrows. The name vanished, he asked, seated across from Captain Hastings in their sitting room where the fire crackled. With determined British cheerfulness, not crossed out, not erased, but vanished. That's what the letter says, replied Hastings, holding the yellowed paper gingerly. The parish register had every christening, marriage, and burial recorded for the past 3 centuries, until this morning, when Reverend Giles opened it to find the latest entry blank, Poirot, a baptism from the day before, wiped clean. Poirot leaned forward. Tell me, mon ami, do you believe in ghostly bells and disappearing ink? Hastings, always loyal but occasionally literal, gave a nervous chuckle. I'm not sure I do, but the whole village seems rattled, and the vicar sounds thoroughly disturbed. He says the child whose name vanished was found dead the following morning. Crib death, they're calling it. Poirot's face changed. He folded his hands slowly, deliberately. Now, that is a sorrowful thing. A child's death is always unnatural to the order of things. Hastings nodded somberly. Poirot stood and walked to the window. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall unseasonably early. He stared at it for a moment before speaking again. There is something, he said, about names. They are sacred to us. We baptize with them, we marry with them, and we bury with them. They are the markers of our place in the world. To lose a name, to have it vanish, is to erase existence itself. No, mon ami, I must see this chapel, you mean. Poirot turned with a faint smile. Yes, Hastings, pack your suitcase. We are going to Devon. They arrived 2 days later, by train and then by hired motorcar, the roads growing narrower and more wild the farther they traveled. Larkwood Hollow emerged from the mist like a faded etching, the pub with its peeling sign of a fox and fiddle, the baker's shop with loaves in the window, and beyond it all, the grey tower of St. Athanasius looming above the trees. They were received at the rectory by Reverend Giles, a gaunt man with watery blue eyes and ink-stained fingers. He looked as though he had been born tired and had not since improved. It's very kind of you to come, Monsieur Poirot, he said, shaking the detective's hand with mild confusion. I wasn't expecting such interest. Poirot inclined his head. The letter was most intriguing. I understand there was a child, recently baptized. The vicar nodded solemnly. Little Lydia Carfax, born to a young couple new to the village, Edward and Maisie Carfax. She was christened last Sunday morning. A lovely ceremony. Her name was entered into the register, of course, and then, Monday morning, I went to log the weekly offerings. The name was gone. A blank space where the entry had been. No smudge, no ink, no trace. I thought it strange, naturally. But then came the news. The child had died overnight. They found her lifeless in her cradle. His voice faltered. The mother is inconsolable. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, and the bell, the midnight bell. No one admits to ringing it. It hasn't chimed at night in years. Certainly not of its own accord. The tower is always locked, and yet it rang 12 times. And the register. The vicar led them to the vestry, where the great leather-bound book sat on a wooden pedestal. Poirot opened it reverently, turning pages slowly. The names were written in careful copperplate. On the final page, near the bottom, was a space, neat, white, and empty. The space between 2 souls. No trace at all. Poirot murmured, I tried everything, said Reverend Giles, rubbing it with charcoal, eating the page, even lemon juice. Nothing emerged. It's as if it were never written. Poirot closed the book gently. Tell me, monsieur, he said, have there been any other disappearances of late? Not of people, but of records, names, objects that carry identity. Reverend Giles hesitated. There was something, he admitted. The plaque under the statue of St. Athanasius, it's blank now. As of this week, we thought it had simply faded. But perhaps he trailed off. Poirot stood very still, then turned to Hastings. There is something wicked here, he said softly. Something that does not announce itself with violence, not yet, but with silence, with absence. The name of a child vanishing is no small thing. Hastings, you think it's connected? Poirot's eyes glittered. In matters of the human soul, nothing vanishes without cause. Even silence speaks, and sometimes it screams. The Carfax cottage lay at the far end of Larkwood Hollow, past the old orchard and the rusted gate that squeaked even in still air. It was a modest two-room structure, its slate roof patched with moss and its garden left unkempt as if grief had choked even the weeds into silence. Poirot and Hastings approached just before noon. The sky hung low, a sheet of dull gray, and the branches of the birch trees clacked together like old bones. Reverend Giles had sent word of their visit, and a young man was waiting on the stoop. He was no more than 30, tall, with a narrow face and dark, restless eyes that seemed to flick toward every movement. His jacket was too large for him, his boots too polished, the look of a man trying to fit into a life not quite his own. You're the gentleman from London, he asked the detective. I am Hercule Poirot, said Poirot gently, and this is my friend, Captain Hastings. You are Mr. Carfax, I presume. The man gave a short, jerky nod. Edward Carfax. You'd best come in. They followed him inside. The front room was dim, the curtains drawn. A kettle sat cold on the hearth. On a small table lay a child's rattle, shaped like a lamb. My wife is resting, Edward said quietly. She's not herself. I understand, Poirot said. We will not stay long. You have suffered a tragedy most profound. But I must ask, the baptism, the child's name in the register, were you present? Of course. I held her myself as the Reverend poured the water. Lydia Mary Carfax, named after Maisie's grandmother. She smiled when the water touched her brow. I remember that, clear as anything. And you saw her name written in the book? I did. The Reverend wrote it while we were still there. I remember thinking how strange it looked to see her name beside all those others. I suppose I thought it made her real. Part of the world, you know. Poirot nodded slowly. And then Edward's face darkened. Maisie went in to feed her at 6 the next morning, she screamed. I found her standing over the cradle. Lydia wasn't moving. He ran a hand through his hair. Dr. Franklin came, said it was one of those things. A weak heart maybe. Or she'd stopped breathing in the night. No signs of pain. No reason. There is always a reason, Poirot murmured. Though it may not always lie in the realm of medicine. Edward looked up sharply. You think someone... I do not know yet what I think, Poirot said. But tell me, did you hear anything unusual the night before? The bell. We both heard the bell. That damned bell. Maisie was scared out of her wits. He swallowed hard. She said it sounded like a warning. Like something was being taken. Poirot nodded solemnly. May I see the nursery? Edward hesitated, then led them down a short hallway. The nursery was a small room with pale blue walls and a wicker cradle by the window. Everything was in order except for the stillness. It was the kind of stillness that repels sound, thick with sorrow and something else. Something colder. Poirot stepped to the cradle. The blankets had not been removed. He touched the wooden frame with a gloved hand. Have you changed anything? Since no couldn't bear to. Poirot studied the room carefully. A stuffed bear on a shelf, a threadbare rug, a single oil lamp, untouched, a faint smell of lavender, lingering but not fresh, and something else. He leaned in toward the cradle. Just visible on the headboard was a faint mark, like a scrawl, hastily scratched, then rubbed out, almost like initials. Did either of you carve this? He asked. Edward stepped closer. No, I've never seen that before. Looks like, what is that? A letter P and an S. Poirot did not respond. He studied the marks closely. The strokes were shallow but deliberate. Not a child's work, and not the work of someone sentimental. Captain Hastings, Poirot said, will you fetch my small notebook from the coat pocket, if you please? Hastings complied, and Poirot carefully copied the scrawl. Then he straightened. Thank you, Mr. Carfax. That will be all for now. Edward hesitated. Do you think it was murder? Poirot met his gaze. I think, monsieur, that something is being hidden here. Whether it is a crime or a curse, we must discover which. They left the Carfax cottage in silence, their footsteps crunching over fallen leaves. Hastings finally spoke. She seemed so loved. I can't imagine why anyone would. Poirot raised a finger. You assume the crime, if crime there is, was against the child, but consider Hastings. What if the true victim is someone else? Or something else entirely? What do you mean? Poirot looked ahead, toward the looming bell tower of St. Athanasius. There are murders of the body, he said quietly, and there are murders of memory. One strikes the flesh, the other the soul. Hastings frowned but said nothing more. They returned to the rectory and found Reverend Giles in his study, hunched over the same letter that had drawn Poirot's attention days ago. The vicar looked up with weary eyes. "You've been to see the Carfaxes?" "Yes," Poirot said. "A tragic household. But I must ask, has anything like this ever happened before? Another child whose name vanished? Or a bell that tolled before death?" Giles was silent a long time. "There is a story," he said finally, "old as the chapel. The villagers call it the tolling of the forgotten. Superstition, I always thought. They say the bell rings when a soul is claimed without God's name, that if a child dies before their name is truly written, not on paper, but in the eyes of heaven, they are lost." He gave a bitter smile. "Hardly Anglican doctrine, of course. And yet, the plaque under the saint's statue has also vanished." Nan. Giles nodded. "It was there just last week, dedicated to a sister Pauline. Her name has simply faded away as if time plucked it from the stone." "Do you know who she was?" "Only that she lived here a century ago, part of a small convent that once stood behind the chapel. Burned down, I believe. Lightning strike, a few nuns perished. Their names were never recorded." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "That is a curious omission." "It was wartime," the vicar offered, though unconvincingly. "Records were misplaced." Poirot folded his hands. "Mademoiselle Pauline, Lydia, Mary Carfax, names erased, forgotten. This chapel. I think Monsieur le Vicar is more than a house of God. It is a house of secrets. He stood tomorrow. I should like to see the bell tower. And then the graveyard." Hastings looked surprised. "You think we'll find something among the tombstones?" Poirot gave him a grim smile. "If names vanish from the book of life, mon ami, then let us consult the book of death." The graveyard of St. Athanasius lay behind the chapel, bordered by low stone walls mottled with lichen. It was the kind of English cemetery where the past lay thick upon the earth, the headstones crooked with age, the inscriptions softened by time and weather, and the air heavy with silence. The oldest graves clustered closest to the chapel wall, as if proximity to holy stone offered better passage to the hereafter. Poirot and Hastings arrived just after breakfast, the early mist still clinging to the ground in silvery swathes. Reverend Giles, with his scarf flapping loosely about his neck, met them at the gate. "You're looking for something specific?" he asked, rubbing his gloved hands together. Poirot nodded. "I am looking for what is not there, Monsieur Giles. Absence is often more telling than presence." The vicar gave a weary smile and led them through the rows of graves. Hastings kept close behind Poirot, careful not to tread directly upon the mounds. "Most of the older stones are unreadable," Giles said. "We've attempted preservation, but the funds are limited, I'm afraid." "Understandable," said Poirot, pausing before a particularly worn stone. He bent forward, examining the eroded inscription with great care. "Here lies Hastings." "Read," squinting. "It's nearly impossible to make out. Only the year 1899. Note the faint traces of lettering," Poirot murmured. "Not weathered, scraped. Oui, mon ami, look here." He pointed with his cane. "The surface bears linear scarring, as if someone deliberately wore down the inscription." Reverend Giles frowned. "Why would anyone do such a thing?" Poirot stood slowly. "That is the question, is it not?" They continued onward. One row, then another. Hastings grew increasingly uneasy as they passed more than a dozen gravestones, all similarly mutilated. Some were wholly blank, others bore only a surname or partial date. Yet a pattern began to form, and Poirot, ever alert to the subtle arrangement of facts, soon came to a halt. "This one," he said softly. "Here is something." The grave in question was modest, its headstone small and unadorned, but the soil around it had recently shifted, the ground disturbed, and, more curiously, the headstone had no inscription at all. Not faded, not scratched, but completely smooth, as though it had never borne a name. "An unmarked grave," said Hastings. "Is that common?" "Very rare," said Giles, "especially here. Even the poorest of villagers were given names in death. This grave, it should not be here." Poirot crouched, brushing his gloved hand along the stone's edge. "It is recent work," he said. "Less than a year, I think." He stood again and looked directly at the vicar. "Tell me who is buried here." Giles shook his head. "I don't know. You keep no map of the plots." "I do, but that grave isn't on it." There was a long silence. Poirot's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "Then it is a grave that should not exist." They returned to the chapel just before midday. A heavy stillness hung over the building, broken only by the low creak of the weather vane above the bell tower. Poirot paused at the threshold, glancing upward with narrowed eyes. "Now, Hastings," he said briskly, "we shall climb." Reverend Giles unlocked the narrow door at the base of the tower. A stone stair spiraled steeply upward, slick with moisture and age. Poirot led the way, cane tapping carefully with each step. The climb was suffocatingly tight. Dust danced in the shafts of light that pierced the slitted windows. The bell chamber, when they reached it, was colder than expected, a tall, shadowed space with the great bronze bell looming at its center like some sleeping beast. Poirot stepped into the gloom. "No rope," he said. "The bell must be rung by mechanism. A wheel and lever." said Giles, pointing to the wooden mechanism at the rear. "Only accessible from up here, and I alone have the key." Poirot examined the lever. The wood was worn but clean. Number 2. Recent scratches. No evidence of tampering. "And yet," he murmured, "someone rang the bell." Hastings cleared his throat. "Could it have been wind?" Poirot looked at him almost sadly. "The wind, Hastings, does many things, but it does not grasp levers and toll bells 12 times at midnight." He turned and began a meticulous circuit of the chamber. His gaze moved slowly from the dust patterns on the floor to the long abandoned corner where an old iron hook hung from a rafter. Then he stopped. Near the wall, behind a stack of unused hymnals, lay a small iron object. He stooped and retrieved it. "A key," Poirot said. It was old, rusted, and ornate, not a modern key, but a chapel key, one that might once have opened doors, long since sealed. Giles looked astonished. "That's not mine. I've never seen it before." Poirot weighed it in his palm, then placed it carefully into a small envelope. "We shall keep this," he said. "I believe it unlocks something important." That afternoon, back in the rectory sitting room, Poirot laid out what he had gathered thus far. Hastings watched as his friend arranged the facts like a chessboard. "We have," Poirot began, "a baptism that disappeared, a child who died in the night, a name erased from a holy book, a bell that tolled without witness, a grave with no inscription, a statue whose plaque has vanished, and now a key to nowhere." Hastings nodded. "And all within a week." "Exactly." Poirot tapped his fingers together. "Now consider, mon ami, the psychology of it. A murderer kills from hate or fear, but what we see here, this is different. This is a slow erasure, a quiet undoing of identity. A war not on the body, but on the name." Hastings frowned. "But why? What could anyone gain from that?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "That, Hastings, is precisely what we must discover." That evening, just as twilight turned the sky the color of bruised rose, a knock sounded at the rectory door. Poirot opened it to find a woman standing on the step, tall, with an angular face and copper hair tucked beneath a wool cap. She was plainly dressed, yet there was something sharp about her, a glint in her eyes that suggested watchfulness. "Detective Poirot," she asked, "I heard you're investigating what happened to the Carfax baby." "I am," he said, stepping aside. "And you are Miss Lenora Vale?" "I run the village archives." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, then perhaps you can help me." "I hope so," she said, "because I've found something I think you ought to see." "Something about that grave you visited this morning." Poirot inclined his head. "Do come in, mademoiselle." She stepped inside, removing her gloves with precise movements. "I was going through the burial records," she said. "Plot 17, the one behind the chapel wall. According to the original maps from 1865, that plot was occupied by Sister Pauline Vale." Poirot froze. "Vale, yes," she said. "My great-great-aunt." She reached into her coat and pulled out a brittle document. "But here's the thing, Monsieur Poirot, her grave was recorded, blessed, and marked. I have the original drawing, but the stone, it's gone blank, and no one recalls it ever having a name." Poirot took the paper gently. "Your family remembers her." Lenora looked pained. "No, just me. The others forgot she existed, as if she'd been swallowed." Poirot's eyes dropped to the document, then rose to meet hers with new intensity. "You were very brave to come forward, Mademoiselle Vale," he said softly, "because I believe what we face here is not a murder, but a campaign." "A campaign?" Hastings echoed. "Yes," Poirot said. "A deliberate campaign to remove certain people from memory, to unwrite them." He tapped the envelope containing the chapel key, "and I believe it begins and ends with whatever lies behind the sealed door beneath the chapel stairs." The stairwell beneath St. Athanasius Chapel was colder than the graveyard itself. It descended in a tight spiral from a forgotten side door behind the vestry, a door sealed so long ago that moss had crept over the threshold and taken root in the very cracks. Few in Lockwood Hollow knew of the passage at all. Even Reverend Giles, custodian of the church for over a decade, confessed he had never opened it. "It leads to the old crypt," he said uneasily as Poirot, Hastings, and Miss Lenora Vale stood before the door the next morning, or what's left of it. The records suggest it was bricked up after the fire, you know, when the convent burned, but no one's dared to go down there since. Poirot regarded the door with a mixture of respect and disdain. It was oak, iron-banded, and clearly medieval in make. There was no visible keyhole, only a rusted lockplate that had long since corroded shut until Poirot reached into his coat and drew out the iron key they had found in the bell tower. It fit with a heavy groan of metal on metal. The mechanism yielded, and the door creaked slowly inward. Hastings peered down the stairs. "Rather dark," he muttered. "Indeed," Poirot said, retrieving a small torch from his coat pocket. "And we must tread carefully, mon ami, for sometimes it is not what is in the dark that frightens us, but what we remember in it." They descended in single file, the beam of light bouncing off damp stone walls. The air smelled of old things, mildew, dust, and a faint trace of something sweeter, like incense left to rot. The stair ended in a narrow corridor, arched and lined with niches. Some were empty, others held crumbling stone sarcophagi. the names too faded to read. One had collapsed entirely, the lid shattered on the floor. Hastings stepped around it with care. "Good Lord," he said, brushing aside cobwebs. "This must be centuries old." Lenora Vale, walking behind Poirot, looked uneasy. "My mother told me once that the nuns were buried down here. After the fire, the church sealed the crypt. They said the dead had been disturbed." "Disturbed how?" Poirot asked. She hesitated. There were whispers that something had been summoned, or that something had awoken when the fire spread. "My mother said her grandmother used to wake up screaming certain nights, always on October 30th. 2 days before Lydia Carfax died," Poirot murmured. They reached the end of the corridor. A small stone chamber opened before them, circular, with a domed ceiling barely holding its weight. At the center stood a pedestal, and on it, a book. A single, unmarked book, bound in dark leather, sealed with a clasp. No title, no markings, no sign of origin. Poirot approached it with deliberate slowness. He did not touch it. "What is it?" asked Hastings. "A book," Poirot said, "that does not wish to be read." Miss Vale stepped forward. "I've seen something like this before. My grandmother had drawings, sketches from the convent archives." The nuns spoke of a book of shadows, a ledger that recorded scenes too great for public confession, names that were erased from history by design. Poirot raised his brows. "And yet, here it lies, not burned, not buried, preserved." He took a breath, unlatched the clasp, and opened the book. At first, the pages were blank. He turned one, then another, yellowed paper, thick and brittle, then writing, faint, like ink that had tried to disappear. He read aloud. "Pauline Vale, Sister of Mercy, confessed to the vanishing of the child. Marie Claire under moonless sky, name struck, by order of the prioress, soul unbound." There was a heavy silence. Lenora paled. "Marie Claire, my grandmother had a locket with that name engraved. She said it was her sister, but no one else ever spoke of her. It was as if she had never existed." Poirot nodded gravely. "This is a book of vanished names, names not forgotten but removed." He turned another page. "Joseph Marcus, accused of theft from the altar box, recorded expunged, buried in secret ground." Another page. "Isabel Denham, midwife, suspected of blasphemy in the stillbirth of twins, removed from parish roll." He turned a final page, and there, in the faintest ink, was the last entry. "Lydia Mary Carfax, baptism incomplete, name erased by unseen hand." Poirot closed the book. Hastings's voice broke the silence. "You mean to say, this book is causing the disappearances?" "No," Poirot said slowly. "This book is not the cause. It is the record. But someone living is using the knowledge within it to destroy identity." "But why?" Poirot turned toward them, eyes blazing. "To punish," he said. "To control. Perhaps even to protect. There is a mind behind this, logical, cunning, and cruel. A mind that believes in erasure as a form of justice." He walked to the wall, running his hand over the stone, and I believe it began with "Sister Pauline Vale." Lenora's face was unreadable. "You think she started this?" Poirot turned. "I think she witnessed something terrible, something that led her or her successors to create a system of removal, a ritual. And now, someone is continuing her work." Lenora looked down. "Then what about Lydia? Why erase her?" "That," Poirot said, "is what we must discover." Next, they resealed the crypt, taking the book with them. Poirot insisted it be stored in the vestry's locked cabinet, under watch. As they emerged into the pale afternoon light, the chapel bells remained silent, but the wind had picked up, stirring the dead leaves into brief flurries along the gravel path. Back inside the rectory, Poirot asked Reverend Giles for every parish record from the last 100 years. Burials, christenings, all of it. The vicar blinked. "That will take time." "Take it," Poirot said, "but begin with the autumns, especially those where bells rang unexpectedly." Lenora Vale remained behind after the others left. She stood by the window, watching the bell tower with narrowed eyes. Poirot approached quietly. "Mademoiselle Vale," he said, "I must ask you something delicate." She looked at him, double quotes, "Yes. Have there ever been gaps in your own memory? Names you knew once but cannot now recall?" She hesitated. "Yes," she whispered. "A girl from school, a neighbor, even a cousin, I think. Faces I remember, but no names." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Then I believe, mademoiselle, that you are closer to this mystery than you realize, and perhaps," he paused, "closer to danger." That night, the bell of St. Athanasius tolled again, only once, but it was enough in the morning. A second name was gone from the register. A man named Alistair Pym, husband to the baker's daughter, vanished from the book of marriages as if he had never walked the aisle, and in his home, his wife awoke in bed beside an empty pillow. Dawn crept reluctantly into Lockwood Hollow, casting long shadows over the sloping thatched roofs and pale fields silvered with frost. The morning air was brittle like glass, and as fragile, for it shattered with the sound of a scream. Hercule Poirot had only just stirred from his bed at the rectory when the vicar's frantic knock rattled the hallway. Giles cried, his voice cracking with alarm. "Come quickly, Mrs. Pym, something dreadful has happened." Poirot was already moving, fastidiousness momentarily sacrificed to urgency. Hastings, still adjusting his tie, Followed without question, they reached the baker's cottage on the high lane in less than 5 minutes. A small crowd had gathered outside, villagers wrapped in shawls and coats, whispering with drawn faces. The door was open, and from within came the broken sobs of a woman in shock. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of flour and grief. Mrs. Evelyn Pym sat at the edge of her bed in the thin housecoat, her hair disheveled and her eyes wide with a grief so raw it stunned the senses. Her hands gripped a pair of spectacles, wire-framed, slightly bent. "My husband," she choked. "He was here beside me. When I woke, gone. Not gone, like gone to the shop, gone. His clothes, his boots, his coat, gone. The photographs." She gestured weakly toward the mantel above the small fireplace. Poirot walked over. There were 3 picture frames. 2 now held nothing. The third bore an image of Mrs. Pym alone, smiling in her wedding dress, with her hand stretched to empty air. "There was a photo of us from the wedding and one from Torquay," she whispered. "I remember them." "I do, but they're blank now." "Blank," murmured Hastings. Incredulous, Poirot examined them. The photo paper was clean, untouched. No damage, no tearing, just empty. "Your marriage certificate?" Poirot asked. Mrs. Pym blinked. "It's always been in the drawer by the kitchen." She stood on shaking legs and staggered toward the cupboard. Yanking open a drawer and rifling through it, she pulled out a sheet of parchment. "There. It should be there." Her fingers moved rapidly over the page, then stopped. No, it's not. It's blank." Poirot took the paper gently. Indeed, the heading remained, Parish of St. Athanasius Certificate of Matrimony. But where names and signatures should have been, there was nothing. The date was there, the witness line, intact. But the groom's name had vanished. "Do you remember the date of your wedding?" Poirot asked softly. "October 12th last year?" He nodded. "Thank you, madame. You are brave to face this." "I'm not mad," she said, pleading. "Now I'm not. He was real. At least he existed." Poirot placed a hand over hers. "Madame, I believe you completely." Outside, the morning light had brightened, but it brought no warmth. Hastings shook his head. "This is worse than I imagined, Poirot. First the child, now a grown man. What kind of criminal makes people disappear from history?" Poirot's face was tight, grave. "This is not a crime of passion or profits, Hastings. It is a campaign. A war waged not with weapons but with forgetting. They are being unmade." "You mean killed?" "Worse, mon ami. Murder leaves a trace, a body, mourning, but this strips the very existence. Mrs. Pym's husband has not only disappeared, he has been erased. Even the memory of him is being pulled apart, thread by thread. And only she remembers. And just as with the child, Lydia, her mother, remembered. Alone, isolated." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Poirot stopped. "Hastings, did you hear her say where she honeymooned? Torquay, wasn't it?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Then we must verify it at once." They made inquiries by telephone to the small guest house named in Mrs. Pym's fading memory. The Trelawney View and the innkeeper, a Mrs. Sedgwick, confirmed that Evelyn Pym had indeed stayed with them alone. "No husband?" "Hastings asked, not that I recall," said the innkeeper crisply. "Young woman, very sweet, booked a double room but never used the second bed. I assumed she'd been jilted or widowed. She looked sad the whole week." Poirot thanked her and ended. "The call she remembers her husband," Hastings said slowly, "but no one else does. Not even the inn and not the register," Poirot murmured. "There is a pattern, Hastings. Those being erased, they are removed from both private memory and public record. Only one person remains who recalls them, one witness." Back at the rectory, they found Reverend Giles pale and shaken. "I checked the marriage register," he said immediately, "where I myself wrote Alistair Pym's name. It's gone, just like Lydia's." "Does the name mean anything to you?" Poirot asked. "Was Alistair Pym a local?" "No, he was from Dorset, I believe. A carpenter. Quiet. I only met him twice." Poirot sat down at the writing desk, fingers steepled. "There must be a connection. Lydia, Alistair, Sister Pauline, all removed. But why? Why them?" He turned to Miss Lenora Vale, who had returned bearing another folder of archival notes. "Mademoiselle Vale, did your great-great-aunt Pauline have any disciplinary record within the convent?" Lenora blinked. "None that I've found. Though there was a rumor she intervened during a punishment, spoke out against the prioress, something about unjust penance." "Unjust?" Poirot repeated softly. "Was there a child involved?" I don't know." Poirot rose, suddenly animated. "There is a thread, a pattern of protection. Each of the vanished may have been tied to injustice. Sister Pauline resisted. Lydia, an innocent, and now Alistair. Perhaps he knew something, or was protecting someone." A knock interrupted them. It was the postman, clutching a sealed envelope. He looked visibly nervous. "This arrived early," he said. "No postmark. Found it at the foot of the chapel door." Poirot opened it carefully. Inside was a torn fragment of parchment, old, fragile. It read, "And their names shall be plucked from the book of the living, as weeds from the garden of sanctity. The bell shall toll for the unworthy, and silence shall be their tomb." No signature, only a faint insignia embossed in wax. A chalice surrounded by thorny vines. Lenora Vale gasped. That was the old convent seal. The Sisters of the Silent Mercy. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Then we are no longer dealing with a solitary actor, Hastings. We are facing something far older and far more organized. He looked toward the chapel, where the bell tower cast its long shadow. The next disappearance, he said grimly, may already be chosen. The postmistress of Lockwood Hollow was a sturdy woman named Mavis Griggs, whose floral dresses and stiff curls belied a mind sharp as shears. She was the keeper of every whispered scandal and stray telegram within the hamlet, and though her mouth was rarely open in surprise, this morning she stood behind her post counter with uncharacteristic stiffness. It was there when I opened, she told Poirot, placing a yellowed envelope on the counter. No stamp, no name, just this. Poirot examined the envelope. It was sealed with wax, old and crumbling, bearing the same Chalice-Anthorn's insignia as the anonymous parchment received the day before. But this one had a recipient. To be delivered to Mademoiselle Lenora Vale, and no other. Lenora, standing beside Poirot, paled. To me, Poirot nodded. Let us open it together. Yes. He broke the seal with care and unfolded the single page within. The handwriting was elegant and old-fashioned, the ink browned by age, but still legible. Child of the bloodline, you trespass on paths long buried. The veil was drawn to protect, not punish. Leave the chapel be, or be silenced like the others. The sisters remain, though we do not wear the veil. Silence followed. Hastings let out a low whistle. It's a threat. Indeed, Poirot said calmly. And a warning. Lenora folded her arms, but her voice trembled. They know I'm involved. They're watching, yes, Poirot said gently. Which means you are close to something they do not wish found. He pocketed the letter carefully. Come, Mies Amos. It is time we spoke with someone who has long hidden behind silence. The last living person who might remember the convent before the fire. Miss Ivy Thrimble was 102 years old, and most days she remembered only 3 things. That sugar was poison, that her brother ran away with a Methodist, and that the bell of St. Athanasius should never be rung after dark. She lived in a small stone house near the village boundary, tended by a niece who claimed Ivy hadn't spoken a full sentence in 5 years. But when Poirot was ushered into her musty parlor, the old woman's clouded eyes fixed on him with sudden, uncanny clarity. I know who you are, she rasped. You're the Belgian with the mustache. Come to stir up the dust. Poirot bowed. Madame, I am most flattered. I seek only the truth. Humph, said Miss Thrimble, propping herself against an embroidered cushion. That's what they all say. He sat across from her, glancing at the room, cluttered, dim, filled with faint echoes of lace and lavender. I have questions about the convent, he said, about Sister Pauline Vale. Her eyes narrowed. Pauline, now there's a name that cuts bone. You remember her? More than I care to, she said darkly. She was the one who tried to stop them, the one who heard the cries. Poirot leaned in. What cries? The children. From beneath the chapel. The sisters said it was the wind. But Pauline, she knew. Why would the sisters hide such a thing? The old woman laughed bitterly. The convent kept secrets like a cat keeps fleas. There was a room under the chapel, a punishment chamber, they called it. They said it was penance, but Pauline said it was cruelty. Lenora spoke for the first time. My Grattant tried to protect someone, didn't she? She did. A girl from the orphanage, Marie-Claire, bright child. Pauline tried to stop the rites, said they were losing their way. Next week fire tore through the dormitories. Pauline died, or so they said. Did you see her body? Poirot asked softly. No one did. Just a closed casket. And no grave I ever saw with her name. Poirot's face hardened. Then perhaps Sister Pauline did not die at all. Ivy's eyes flicked to Lenora. If she lived, then she's the one behind this. She knew too much. Poirot stood slowly. Or perhaps someone else is using her name, her memory, to finish what she refused to begin. Back in the rectory, Poirot gathered his notes beneath the amber glow of a desk lamp. A chill had settled in the room, and Hastings poured them both tea with extra sugar. We now have 3 disappearances, Hastings said. Lydia, Alistair, and possibly Marie-Claire. Poirot nodded. Each separated by decades, yet bound by the same thread, erasure. He pointed to a sketch of the chapel grounds. Hastings, this book of shadows we found, it was not meant to destroy. It was a record, yes, but Pauline may have kept it to protect the truth. The entries are sparse, but none are arbitrary. What if she documented those already targeted? By the sisters, you mean? She knew what they were doing. I believe she tried to stop them. She likely hid the book beneath the chapel, and someone else has now found it. Poirot glanced at the sealed envelope again. SM Sisters of Mercy, or perhaps someone acting under that name. Lenora frowned, but who would still believe in their rituals? It's the 20th century. Ah, Poirot said quietly. You mistake this for madness. But no, I believe this is purposeful. A doctrine carried by someone intelligent. Someone with access to the church. To the records. He paused. And someone who fears exposure. Later that night, Poirot could not sleep. He walked the cold corridors of the rectory, his dressing gown fastened tight, candle in hand. The wind outside had risen, howling through the eaves like a voice trying to form words. He paused by the vestry door. Something was wrong. The cabinet where the Book of Shadows had been locked, it was open, and the book gone. Poirot stood utterly Still, then, without turning, he said, "Whoever you are very close now, but I warn you I have never lost a case, and I do not intend to lose one to a ghost." The next morning began with tension so thick it seemed to settle in the fog. Larkwood Hollow looked the same, ivy clinging to chimney pots, sheep grazing sleepily on the hills, but for those who had seen the Book of Shadows, the village now felt like a chessboard. The missing book was no random theft. Someone was watching them, someone within reach. Reverend Giles stood pale-faced in the rectory kitchen as Poirot stirred his morning coffee. "Only I had the key," he said. "For the third time, I locked it myself, and the drawer wasn't forced." "I would have noticed," Poirot nodded. "Then perhaps someone used a key very like yours." "Or your key itself," Hastings added. "While you slept," the vicar flushed. "I keep it under my pillow." Poirot raised a single eyebrow. "A dangerous place, mon ami, for keys and for secrets." Lenora Vale arrived moments later, her face drawn but determined. She had spent the early morning scouring the archives again. Her news, when it came, was quietly explosive. "I found something," she said, placing a brittle document on the table. "It's from 1927, the final recorded order from the prioress before the convent closed." Poirot adjusted his pince-nez and scanned the writing. "All signs are to be erased. The ritual shall not be passed down. The bell must not toll. Seal the chamber and silence the names. Mercy through forgetfulness. May Pauline forgive us." "It reads like a confession," Hastings said. Poirot tapped the word mercy. "It reads like an abandonment," he said. "They were ashamed, afraid. But someone read this not as warning, but as instruction." Shortly before midday, Poirot requested to be left alone in the chapel. He stood beneath the high, arched ceiling of St. Athanasius, tracing the lines of the building with his eyes. Dust filtered through the air like floating parchment, and the light pouring through the stained glass windows painted the stone in shades of crimson, gold, and deep indigo. There were 12 windows. Each one depicted a saint, their names inscribed. In Gothic lettering on scrolls of glass, Poirot walked the perimeter. Slowly. St. Matthew, St. Agatha, St. Cecilia. But the 11th window, the one directly opposite the altar, was different. It was not a saint at all. It showed a nun, kneeling before an open book, surrounded by vines of white roses and a silver chalice. Her face was turned downward, obscured by shadow. The inscription beneath was worn, nearly unreadable. He moved closer. The name, Sister Pauline, but someone, not time, had tampered with the glass. The name had been scraped, barely perceptible beneath the surface scratches. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He took a handkerchief from his pocket, folded it, and gently pressed it against the base of the window. With the other hand, he tapped the stone. Ledge beneath. Hollow. He knelt, inspecting the small ridge where glass met masonry. A faint seam, almost invisible, ran around the frame with gloved fingers. He pressed a click. The panel swung inward slightly. Poirot smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Come then," he whispered. "Let us see what Sister Pauline truly left behind." The hidden compartment held a narrow wooden box, plain, dark-stained, locked with a clasp, much like the Book of Shadows. But this time, Poirot did not need to break it. The same rusted key from the bell tower fit perfectly. Inside were 2 items. The first, a letter addressed not to any person, but to the one who still remembers. The second, a photograph. It was sepia-toned, folded once through the center. A group of 6 women stood before the chapel steps, 5 in nuns' habits, and 1 in ordinary dress. A girl, perhaps 16. Marie-Claire. Pauline stood behind her, her hand resting protectively on the girl's shoulder. Poirot unfolded the letter, and read it in silence. "Stop to the one who remembers. If you have found this, it means my final effort was not in vain." The others believed silence was mercy. They were wrong. The child they punished, Marie-Claire, was not cursed but gifted. She remembered the names of the forgotten. She saw those who others chose to erase. The prioress feared her, as she feared all that could not be controlled. They locked her below. I tried to stop them. The fire was not an accident. I escaped, but my name was taken. I have hidden myself behind the veil of the chapel. Even now I live among the stones. I will not let another child suffer for the sins of silence, but I am old. Now if you would finish what I began, you must go to the well beneath the garden. The truth sleeps there, waiting to be named again." Pauline Poirot stood very still. Then he folded the letter and placed it carefully inside his coat. That evening, he gathered Hastings, Lenora, and Reverend Giles in the vestry. He did not sit. "There are forces here," Poirot said. "Not supernatural, but human, dangerous, and precise. The disappearance of Lydia Carfax was not chance, nor was the erasure of Alistair Pym. These acts are connected by more than time. They are tied by place." He pointed to the map of the chapel grounds. "There is a disused well beneath the garden. It was said to be sacred. I believe it is something else, a hiding place. Perhaps for those the sisters condemned. Perhaps for those who escaped." Reverend Giles looked deeply uncomfortable. "But surely, if there were remains or records," Lenora added. Poirot nodded. "Precisely. Either would be fatal to whoever now carries the torch of the erased. For if proof exists that Sister Pauline survived, or that Marie-Claire did, it would unravel everything. and someone is willing to kill or vanish to protect it, Hastings said grimly. Yes, Poirot said, and that someone is close, very close. They walk these halls, they wear polite smiles, and they know we are now dangerously near the truth. He turned to Lenora. You must come with me. You are the only living descendant of Pauline Vale. The well may only open for a veil. Lenora swallowed, her voice a whisper. Then let's go tonight. As the moon rose over the chapel, Poirot and his companions stood in the overgrown garden behind the rectory, lanterns in hand. The well was concealed beneath a crumbling trellis and a patch of thorny roses. Reverend Giles helped them pull the vines aside. The stone circle was ancient, lichen-covered with an iron ring fixed into its side. A round wooden cover lay on top, warped and nailed shut. Poirot placed his hand on the wood. Names, he said softly, are the architecture of memory. Someone has tried to unbuild that structure, but the truth means amiss. The truth resists erasure. He turned to Lenora. Are you ready? She nodded, took the iron ring, and pulled the lid, groaned, and opened. The air that came from below was cool, earthy, and underneath it, a scent faintly sweet like dried flowers. A ladder descended into darkness. Poirot looked at the others. Come, he said, let us see who waits to be remembered. The lantern cast a flickering circle of light as Poirot descended the iron rungs into the well shaft. The stone walls were slick with condensation, and every creak of the ladder echoed up through the hollow like a whisper trying to escape. Behind him came Lenora Vale, steady despite the weight of the truth they pursued. Hastings followed, breath tight and cautious, while Reverend Giles hesitated above, staring down into the dark with open fear but no words of protest. The bottom was not what they expected. Instead of a pit or pool of water, the base of the shaft opened into a small cavern, perhaps part of a natural fissure once diverted for holy water, then forgotten. The floor was uneven, packed earth and shattered stone. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of dust, time, and something old and floral, dried lavender. Perhaps Lenora swept her lantern around, or she breathed. There, carved into the stone walls in painstaking Gothic script, were names. Dozens. No dates, no epitaphs, just names, first and last, cut deep and firm. Some familiar, some not. Marie-Claire Vale, Isabel Denham, Joseph Marcus, Pauline Vale, and at the very center, Lydia Mary Carfax. Poirot stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He placed a gloved hand over the name of the child. It is here, he said softly. She was here, not in body perhaps, but in purpose. Someone brought her name to the others. Hastings turned, eyes wide. What does it mean? Why carve these names down here? Lenora answered, her voice tremulous. Because no one else would. These are the ones they tried to erase. Sister Pauline must have come here, hidden them. This was her ledger, her truth. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, a counterbalance to the Book of Shadows. That book was used to identify and eliminate. But this, he gestured to the wall, is where she preserved the memory of those they condemned, etched them into stone so they could not be forgotten. They stood in silence. Then Poirot noticed something else at the far end of the cavern. Half buried in rubble and roots was an iron casket. He stepped closer and swept the soil away with his cane. Help me, Hastings. Together they pulled the small box free. The hinges groaned in protest, but the lid eventually yielded. Inside were several tightly rolled scrolls, bound with black ribbon. Lenora unrolled one carefully. It's a confession, she whispered, written by one of the sisters, Sister Marguerite. It says she witnessed children being taken below the chapel, not for punishment, for penance. Some were kept in darkness for days. Others vanished. Poirot read over her shoulder, his eyes flashing with understanding. That we called it salvation. The scroll read, we believed the prioress. We thought we were helping them forget sin. But when Marie-Claire began naming the others, when she said she remembered who had been taken, the prioress ordered her silenced. That is when Sister Pauline turned against us. That is when the fire began. It was deliberate, Poirot said. The fire was not an accident. It was meant to destroy the evidence and those who knew, and yet Pauline lived, Lenora murmured. She lived and she built this place. Poirot nodded. Yes, and someone, now, is undoing her work. Hastings exhaled. So whoever stole the Book of Shadows, they're following the prioress's orders, or pretending to. Poirot said grimly. It may be zealotry, it may be power, but this is not simply madness. It is doctrine, carried across time. Suddenly, Lenora turned pale. My name, she said. Is it on this wall? Poirot and Hastings scanned the carvings. Dozens of names, some partially eroded but none that read Lenora Vale. No, Poirot said gently. And that, mademoiselle, may be the only reason you are still alive. They emerged from the garden well just after sunset. The light was fading quickly, the sky bleeding lavender and orange above the chapel roof. Poirot sealed the well again. There are now too many truths to hide, he said. And yet, someone will try. We must draw them out. How? Hastings asked. Poirot turned, eyes glittering with resolve. By tempting them with their greatest fear, exposure. That night, a notice was placed on the chapel door, written in Poirot's own hand and signed by Reverend Giles. It read, Notice to the parish of Lockwood Hollow. A full investigation of historical records and practices at St. Athanasius will take place tomorrow. Under the supervision of the Church of England's Diocesan Council, any and all documents relating to baptisms, burials, and convent operations shall be examined publicly. Witnesses are invited to come forward, before their names are erased forever. Reverend Giles read it twice before affixing it to the door. They'll come, he said softly, or they'll try to stop it. Yes, Poirot said. Either way the veil will lift. Just before midnight, Poirot stood at the window of his room watching the chapel bell tower. The wind had picked up again. Hastings joined him, wrapped in his dressing gown. Do you think they'll strike again? Poirot's voice was quiet. If they believe someone else must be erased before morning, then yes, they will. Who do you think is next? Poirot turned. That, Hastings, is precisely what I mean to discover tonight. He moved to the desk and laid out the records again. Names that had vanished, dates, family lines, the carvings in the cavern, the Book of Shadows, the threat to Lenora, and then finally the phrase in the anonymous letter, "We do not wear the veil." He stared at those words. Suddenly his face changed. He rose. Quickly, come, Hastings. We must go to the chapel now. There is someone already inside. They arrived moments later, their lanterns piercing the deepening dark. The chapel was open. Inside, by the pulpit, stood a figure in a long black cloak, not a nun's habit but familiar all the same. It was Miss Edwina Cole, the chapel's housekeeper. She turned slowly, face pale, lips trembling. I begged them, she said softly, not to leave it to me. I'm only the last hand, the last watcher. Poirot stepped forward. You have been preserving the ritual. I didn't kill anyone, she whispered. I only followed what was written, the bell, the name, the register. But then that girl came, Lenora, asking questions. I thought if I erased Lydia, if I removed her from the book, it would protect the rest. You erased Alistair Pym too. She shook her head violently. No, that wasn't me. That was someone else, someone higher. Someone in robes without robes. Poirot froze. Who? But Edwina's eyes were already glazed. She looked toward the altar. The names must be silenced, she whispered, so that peace may remain. Then she stepped forward and collapsed in a dead faint at Poirot's feet. Miss Edwina Cole was unconscious for nearly 10 minutes, and during that time Poirot barely moved from her side. Hastings had fetched water and Reverend Giles had arrived with smelling salts. But Poirot remained kneeling, not in panic but in silent contemplation. When Edwina stirred at last, blinking up at the high vaulted ceiling of the chapel, she seemed dazed, as if she had awoken not from fainting but from a trance. Where am I? She whispered. In the house of God, Poirot said gently, but I fear someone has turned it into a house of silence. She sat up with Hastings's help and looked around, confused. What happened? You collapsed. After confessing your role, Poirot said evenly, you rang the bell. You erased Lydia's name. You said you were the last watcher. Her mouth worked silently for a moment. Then she dropped her face into her hands. I only did what I was told. By whom? Poirot asked. Her hands fell away, and she looked at him with hollow eyes. I don't know. I never saw a face, only letters. Instructions slipped beneath the chapel door, always in the same envelope. Wax seal, the chalice and thorns. Hastings and Lenora exchanged glances. Poirot narrowed his eyes. For how long have you received these? 3 years, always before All Hallows Eve, always telling me a name must be removed, or else darkness would fall again. They said if I refused, the whole village would suffer. Poirot rose slowly. And you but believed them? She looked ashamed. I was afraid, and I thought perhaps they knew better. That this was some secret of the church, some holy order I'd never been meant to understand. Poirot's voice softened. You were manipulated, mademoiselle. But now is the time to end your silence. You said someone else erased Alistair Pym, someone in robes without robes. What did you mean? Edwina shivered. I meant someone of the order, but not visibly so. Someone who hides in plain sight. They have power, influence. She looked toward Reverend Giles, who stiffened but said nothing. Not him, she said quickly, but someone who speaks with authority. Poirot stepped back, thoughtful. Then he said, let us return to the rectory. This chapel is not safe after nightfall. Back at the rectory, Poirot lit the lamp in the sitting room and motioned for Hastings and Lenora to sit. Edwina, still pale, was given tea and a blanket. Reverend Giles sat apart, unusually quiet. Poirot paced for a moment before speaking. There is a doctrine at work here, a belief system passed down, adapted, and hidden behind the veil of church language. It claims to serve mercy through forgetting. But what it truly serves is control. He turned to Edwina. Someone used your hands, but they used others too. You are not the first, merely the last. She looked up. Then who was before me? Poirot opened his notebook. Whoever it was, they had access to the church, to records, and to fear. We know now that the erasures target those who witness, those who remember. Lydia Carfax was a child whose name stood out, perhaps prophetically. Alistair Pym may have discovered something. And Lenora, he looked at her with warning. You are being hunted not for what you've done, but for what you might reveal. Lenora nodded. I understand. Poirot turned to Hastings. Mon ami, I must ask you to do something difficult, of course. You must return to the garden, to the well. I believe there is one more document we missed. Something beneath the soil in the casket's compartment. You think it's important. I think it is crucial, Poirot said, and it will buy us time. I intend to set a trap, one that catches not the hands, but the mind behind these vanishing. While Hastings departed with a lantern and shovel, Poirot returned to the chapel, this time alone. He carried with him the letter from Sister Pauline and a single photograph of the convent group, now pressed between two panes of glass. He knelt at the altar and placed both items beneath the pulpit, and then he waited. The chapel remained dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the stained windows. Time passed. Poirot did not move. It was nearly 2 in the morning when he heard it, a soft footfall, the rustle of fabric, and then a figure stepped out from behind the vestry curtain. Not Edwina, not a nun. It was Archdeacon William Swithin, the visiting official from Exeter who had arrived days earlier to inspect the diocese records, a man revered, polished, above suspicion. His eyes gleamed in the half-light. So, he said, voice like silk over iron, you found it. Poirot did not move. I did, he said, though I had not expected you to reveal yourself so soon. Swithin stepped forward. You're clever, Monsieur Poirot, but you've misunderstood. Have I? Yes, you think this is about crime, but it is about cleansing. He gestured to the chapel. This place, it is tainted. It always was. The sisters were fools, but they understood something vital. The soul must forget to survive. Some memories rot from within. Poirot stood. You murdered those people. I erased them. Swithin corrected. Erasure is mercy. Pauline never understood. She preserved names that should never have been remembered. He stepped forward, cold fury in his voice. Now, you think naming the dead protects the living, but it dooms them. The longer the memory lingers, the more it festers. The ritual is the cure. Poirot's voice was calm and Lenora, she is the final breach, he said. Pauline's blood. The last key. Once she is silenced, the cycle ends. The chapel will fall into ruin, and the past will finally sleep, and you will be its custodian. Poirot murmured. A murderer turned priest. Swithin smiled. No one will believe you, Poirot returned the smile, cool and perfect. Ah, but I have never needed belief, monsieur. Only truth. At that moment, the side door burst open and Hastings entered, lantern in one hand, followed by Lenora and Reverend Giles, and behind them 2 constables from Exeter. Poirot stepped aside. The good archdeacon has confessed, he said. Swithin paled. You could not resist speaking, Poirot said. It is your weakness, the desire to justify. The constables moved in. William Swithin, one said, you are under arrest for conspiracy, falsification of parish records, obstruction of ecclesiastical investigation, and suspected involvement in the deaths of Lydia Carfax and Alistair Pym. You can't prove anything, Swithin snapped. No. Poirot lifted a parchment, the final scroll from the casket, signed in your own hand, dated 20 years ago. You were the first to take the veil without the veil, and now you will take your place among the named in judgment. The arrest of Archdeacon William Swithin sent quiet shockwaves through Lockwood Hollow. There was no scandal, no public announcement. Poirot ensured that. The constables removed him discreetly. Under cover of early dawn, their footsteps hushed. On the frost-covered lane, the villagers never saw it happen, though some would later say they had sensed something leave the chapel that morning, a presence, or perhaps a pressure finally lifted. By midday, the fog began to clear. And Poirot, after a morning of precise handwriting, tea with precisely 1½ lumps of sugar, and an hour of reflection by the fireside, called his companions together for one final gathering in the chapel of St. Athanasius. Reverend Giles stood behind the pulpit, looking more composed than he had in weeks. Lenora Vale sat near the front, her hands clasped but no longer trembling. Hastings lingered at Poirot's side, brow furrowed in that familiar way, half admiration, half uncertainty. Poirot stepped forward. There are those, he began, who believe that forgetting is a form of healing, that to forget the pain, the shame, or the guilt is to become clean. But forgetting, he continued, it is avoidance, it is avoidance. The wound festers beneath the bandage. He turned toward the carved names now displayed on the long cloth scroll, copied by Lenora from the well chamber. These were the forgotten: Lydia Mary Carfax, Alistair Pym, Maricela Vale, Sister Pauline herself. All names erased from books, from memory, and from prayer, by those who believed silence could preserve holiness. Poirot paused, then raised his chin. But there is no holiness in erasure, only fear. There was silence in the chapel, the kind that resonated rather than echoed. Hastings spoke. But will the church restore their names? On paper, I mean. Reverend Giles nodded slowly. They will have already written to the diocese. Lydia's baptism will be restored, Alistair's marriage recorded, and the others, as far back as we can trace, will be noted in a new memorial register. It may not be what they deserved, but it is something. Poirot offered a small smile. It is not justice by law, but it is justice by memory. Lenora stood then, voice clear. My great-great-aunt tried to protect them. She saw what was happening, and she fought it. She didn't burn with the convent. She survived, and she gave the rest of her life to remembering those who were being silenced. Poirot nodded. Indeed, Sister Pauline Vale was not a martyr. She was a witness, and her legacy lives in you, Mademoiselle Vale. She bowed her head, tears rising but not falling. That afternoon Poirot and Hastings walked once more through the village. It was quiet, peaceful, in a way it hadn't been for some time. The strange thing is, Hastings said as they passed the baker's shop, the villagers don't seem to remember Alistair Pym even now. They will, Poirot replied. Memory takes time to return, just as healing does. When his name reappears in the records, when his photograph is reprinted, the threads will pull taut again. The mind can forget, yes, but it can also recover. They stopped at the chapel gate. A new plaque had been mounted on the gatepost, plain and simple. The chapel of St. Athanasius, dedicated to those whose names were taken, and to the memory of Sister Pauline Vale. The name is the soul's anchor. Hastings read it aloud, softly, then looked at Poirot. And what of the chapel now? Will people still come, after what happened? Poirot tilted his head. I believe they may come more than ever. Not to forget, but to remember. That evening, Poirot packed his valise with the usual precision. His socks were aligned by shade, his shaving brush nestled in its own silk pouch, and his silver pocket watch polished to mirror gleam. Hastings, of course, was a different matter, still struggling to locate a missing cufflink and grumbling about his crumpled jacket. I say, Poirot, this case was unlike any we've ever had. Hastings, it was a case of memory, of names, of what it means to be known. Hastings scratched his head. But I still don't quite understand how you knew it was Archdeacon Swithin. Poirot paused, savoring the moment. Mon ami, it was the details as always. He arrived the day before Lydia's baptism, claimed he was sent by the diocesan council, but they had no record of it. His robes were correct, but his cross was an old design pre-Reformation. A touch of theatre, perhaps. His speech so perfect it felt practiced, and when I saw the seal on the Book of Shadows matched the letters Edwina received, it was only a matter of time before he revealed himself. And he confessed, didn't he? Hastings said. That was quite something. Poirot allowed himself a satisfied smile. They always do, Hastings. When the lie is built upon silence, the need to explain becomes overwhelming. Hastings sighed. It's odd. I keep thinking about the bell. Do you suppose it'll ring again? Poirot looked out the window toward the chapel tower. No, he said. I think the bell has done its duty. It tolled for those whose names were stolen. Now they are returned. The chapel will fall silent again, not with fear, but with peace. That night, the bell did not toll, but the register in the vestry showed a new page, freshly inked, carefully, written by Reverend Giles, under the title, The Names Remembered: Lydia Mary Carfax, Alistair Pym, Marie Claire Vale, Pauline Vale, Isabel Denham, Joseph Marcus, erased not by time, but by fear, remembered by courage. It was a peculiarity of Hercule Poirot that after every case, whether it ended in applause or discomfort, triumph or quiet resolution, he required what he called his heure de réflexion, an hour of reflection. It was never skipped, never hurried to Poirot. The solving of a crime was not complete until it had been fully understood, not just in fact, but in feeling. This time, his hour was taken in the churchyard of St. Athanasius. The wind had calmed, the mist lifted, and the chapel bell stood mute in the tower. Below, Poirot sat on a wooden bench between two rose bushes, a thick wool coat over his knees and his cane resting against the bench rail. Hastings sat beside him, the silence unusually companionable. For several minutes Poirot simply watched the chapel. Then, at last, he spoke. You know, Hastings, there are crimes of greed, crimes of jealousy, even crimes of revenge. But this was a crime of ideology. Hastings nodded. I've never seen anything like it. Poirot gestured with one hand. To erase someone from the record is not to kill them, and it is worse, to take away the memory of their existence, to make it so that no one mourns, no one even notices their absence. That is a kind of annihilation. The body may be untouched, but the soul is stripped. He paused. And yet it was done in the name of mercy. Hastings frowned. Do you think Archdeacon Swithin really believed that, or was it just an excuse? Poirot pursed his lips. Oh, he believed it entirely. That was his danger. He saw himself as a purifier, not a murderer. To such men, morality, but it becomes flexible. They twist it into knots, until cruelty wears the robe of virtue. They sat in silence a little longer. The wind rustled the dry ivy along the chapel walls. Somewhere, a bird sang a late call, hopeful in the growing dusk. Poirot took a small notebook from his pocket and opened it to a blank page. I made a list, he said, a list, of those who were forgotten, and those who remembered. Them, Lydia remembered by her mother, Alistair by his wife, Marie Claire by Sister Pauline. The connection, Hastings, was not just the act of remembering, but the courage to remember alone. Hastings stared into the garden. You think that's why the others weren't erased? Yes, because they spoke. When memory is spoken, it becomes real. The erasers depended on silence, on secrecy, but each time someone broke that silence, and that someone was a threat. He glanced toward the chapel door. Lenora, in her own way, was the final piece, the one who remembered not out of obligation but instinct. She felt something was wrong and she acted. Hastings shifted in his seat. "I say, Poirot, you're rather fond of her, aren't you?" Poirot gave a rare smile. "She has the strength of the Vale bloodline, and she did not let grief make her cruel." Later that evening, Lenora joined them in the rectory parlor. She held a sealed envelope in her hand and wore a look of calm determination. "It's from the bishop," she said. "A formal apology, and a statement of intent." Poirot opened it and read in silence. Then he passed it to Hastings. The letter was brief but powerful. The church acknowledged the historical wrongs of the convent, the failings of oversight, and the errors of those who continued the doctrine of mercy through erasure. They agreed to fund a new archive in Larkwood Hollow dedicated to preserving not only the truth of the chapel's past, but the full names of all who had been unjustly forgotten. Lenora smiled faintly. "They've asked me to oversee it. The archive." Poirot inclined his head deeply. "A most fitting appointment. Mademoiselle, it is not easy to guard the memory of others." She hesitated, then reached into her satchel. "There's one more thing." She unwrapped a faded piece of cloth, revealing a small rusted locket. Inside, a portrait miniature, a girl with soft curls and eyes that burned with defiance. "Marie," she whispered. "I found this behind the chapel organ, tucked into the beams, hidden maybe by Pauline or by Marie Claire herself." Poirot took it with reverence, then handed it to Hastings without a word. "She lives now," he said softly. "Not in body but in name, and that is what matters." Before their departure the next morning, Poirot made one final visit to the garden behind the rectory. The well had been resealed with stone and mortar, the carvings inside preserved by photographs and careful transcription. A simple plaque now marked the site. "The garden of the unnamed." Here were hidden the names taken by silence. Now they speak again. He stood there a long while. At last Hastings joined him, suitcase in hand. "Train's in 20 minutes, old chap." Poirot nodded. "I am ready." On the platform at Larkwood Hollow Station, as the train hissed into place, Lenora Vale arrived carrying a wrapped parcel. "I wanted you to have this," she said. "From the archive." Poirot unwrapped it. Inside was a bound volume, leather-backed, and titled in gold, "The Chapel of Vanishing Names." A record restored. He touched the cover. "Merci, mademoiselle, I shall treasure it." She offered her hand. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for giving them back to history." Poirot bowed. "It was not I who restored them, Mademoiselle Vale. It was you." The whistle blew. Hastings climbed aboard. Poirot lingered a moment longer. "Until next time," he said gently. Then he too boarded. As the train pulled away, the chapel bell did not toll, but from its tower, a new wind blew, light, clean, and filled with voices, long silenced, now carried through time. They were remembered, and in the mind of Hercule Poirot, where every name was sacred, they would never be forgotten again.